What secret was revealed when cleaning out the home of a deceased family member?
Grandpa did drawings of the faces of the people he killed in WW2. Nobody knows why, but my grandma said he had a lot of guilt over the things he saw, so my guess is he didn't want to forget them or didn't feel like he should be allowed to forget them. I'm African American and my husband is white. My father faced a lot of prejudice during his lifetime, and I was terrified of telling him that the white guy I'd been on a date or two with I was getting serious with. The first time I brought my now husband home, my dad was courteous but distant. Miraculously, by the second time my father literally gushed all over my husband. Even my siblings were shocked. When we got married, he was beaming. It was odd, but I was just happy my husband had won him over. My mom died in 2014 and my father in 2021. When my siblings and I went to clean out the house, in his safe along with other important documents, we found letters that my husband had written to my father 24 years before about how he felt about me, how he was serious about his relationship with me, how he was planning to go to law school. He did. He's an attorney now. How he respected that he'd gone through so much in his lifetime, and eventually how he loved me and how with his blessing, he was going to propose. My husband never told me he'd written my father, and my father never told me he'd been corresponding with my husband. It was so emotional finding those. I still tear up when I think about it. When I got home, my husband finally showed me the letters my father had written back. A diary with only a few entries from my uncle who lived alone. One of the entries was about how sad he was to have never met anyone or had children and how lonely he was. Broke my heart. That my dad hid money all over the house. Not huge amounts, mind you, but $60 here, $120 there. Felt like a bit of a scavenger hunt when we were cleaning out his stuff. He was always a bit of a sneakily generous guy. Always gave me and my brothers a secret handshake with money tucked in his palm when we'd go back to school after a weekend home, etc. So wouldn't be surprised if he'd done it intentionally. Made us smile every time we found some. IRC, I think the final total was somewhere around $800. Not a secret, but a near secret. My grandfather, who spoke English as a third language, was a bit of a hoarder. Lots of old shit stockpiled in his basement, but well organized. Imagine a generic episode of Hoarders, but with a prepper OCD vibe. Everything was sanitized, stacked/nested, and grouped logically. It was like the stockroom for a store that wasn't yet sure what products it was selling and wanted to be ready. So we find a cylindrical container that was kinda heavy for its size, and it had the label Old Penis. It was one of those black plastic film containers. Hesitant, but curious, we removed the lid. It contained a collection of 1-cent pieces which had been minted in the first half of the 20th century. Part of me was disappointed, part of me was relieved. Edit. I'm glad so many people got a chuckle from the mystery of my grandfather's old penis. It was an innocent typo, but he was a jovial man and would have enjoyed knowing it made so many people laugh. I have so many after recently losing my mother first, August 2021, and my father, May 2022. I was the executor of the estate, so lots of work, including taking care of all bills, cleaning out house and variety of other things. Here is list of surprises and probably will diverge slightly to encompass things I learned about my mother and father in the process. My father's death was a surprise and the result of bacterial and fungal sepsis. Although I had been helping him with health needs over extended stay in rehab and was very familiar with his state, there were surprises. My father did keep some stashes of cash, but last I heard he suspected someone stole his stash. I knew how he liked to hide cash in used checkboxes with old checkbooks top. When going through Family Safe, I started to find bank envelopes with 10 100 bills at the back of old checkboxes. I called my wife and sister as I continued to go through and found 8,700 over the course of an hour. My dad's best friend, who was his gambling buddy, let me know that my dad would bring one of those envelopes every time he gambled and the $1,000 was his limit. But even more interesting, over their 20 years of going to casino together, my father, who was a numbers guy and played the slots, only lost one time. I remember the time he lost and how mad he was about it. Finally, on this topic, I worked at his, now my, second home, and on Zoom calls when bored I would go through his desk and literally continued to find money daily for weeks. My father was meticulous in record keeping. I had tax returns, checkbooks, old notes where he had loaned money to other people, all dating back to mid-1970s. My mother had cancer for 30-plus years, and when she died the official report was congestive heart failure. We, including my father, thought that was a mistake and she must have died of COVID. She was sick enough from cancer that we didn't question it. In going through paperwork, after my dad had passed away, she was being treated for years for heart failure, but it was literally the last thing in a long list of more acute ailments. Separately, since she had smoked heavily for 30 years before cancer, we don't think she wanted us to know, as the heart failure was likely a result of the years of prior smoking. Finally, I was taking care of my dad's expenses for the last 5 months of his life while he was in hospital and then in rehab. One of my father's checking accounts didn't seem to be used for anything except to pay one person. It was a female Hispanic name, and there were almost weekly payments. When visiting my dad in rehab one day, going over various things on his bills, I got the nerve up to ask him who is, and gave him the name. He looked at me with a wry grin and said, "I guess it is time to tell you about the other family." Well, it was the cleaning lady, and my sister had been paying her, so I didn't know her name. So a non-find, but very funny. Great topic, original poster. You do learn a lot post-death, and although I knew my dad better than anyone, I wish I could have had the additional info prior to his death. My great-grandmother. She was a makeup consultant for Mary Kay for over 50 years. She had money, a nice house, was an amazing and sweet lady. She even had what was basically a celebration event at Mary Kay for how much of a dedicated worker she was, and one of Mary Kay's grandchildren came down to personally thank her himself. That entire event was even on the news as well, Dallas News, if anyone wants to try and find it. It was pretty cool. She was a wonderful woman, loved to spoil me, and was seemingly the best great-grandmother anyone could ask for. But she sadly passed about 2 to 3 years before I graduated high school. All I knew of her was that she was amazing and sweet, but according to my mom and the rest of my family, there was a wild side to her. According to them, once someone became 18, she wasn't that sweet and innocent woman. Instead, she was cracking jokes, being inappropriate, giving sex tips, making sex jokes, basically the life of the party, all bottled into a short 98. At the time of her death, woman. Apparently, when my mom and other family had to clean out her house, in her office there was a closet and bookshelf full of books related to sex and fashion. In the closet was 2 boxes containing books that were almost 50 years old. One box has a sex Bible with a bunch of information on positions for getting pregnant, positions for better female/male pleasure, and ways to spice up sex and make it more fun. There was another book in these 2 boxes that was important to note, but it wasn't a book, it was a journal she wrote in. A journal dating almost 45 years worth of biographical information. A lot of the info within this journal was about her sex life, how good sex felt, how much fun she had, a brief summary of her sex life before the point she started the journal, and then the rest was the almost 45-year journey she had with a man named Russ, who she went into extreme detail with. She described the length of his member, how thick it was, the girth, how good it felt, and she went into very verbose and honestly professional writer levels of detail about how great everything was. Excluding those 2 books, there were a bunch of pictures taken of her and Russ doing these activities. Honestly, it doesn't ruin how I perceive my great-grandmother at all. In fact, it makes me think of her even better. No, this short and sweet old lady was the most sex-crazy lady I'd ever meet, and probably will ever know. I do miss her a lot, and wish I could get to know her the way everyone else had, especially because I apparently have her hair, and have even inherited some of her looks, at least according to my mom. A bonus thing they also found in her house is a journal dating back from the 19th century, where apparently an ancestor of mine actually invented a prototype version of the cotton gin almost a year before Eli Whitney, but my ancestor didn't know they'd have to patent it to actually take credit for it. That my mom took the $100,000 in insurance money from my dad's death in 1995 that was earmarked only for my brother and me for when we turned 18, and instead took it for herself and bought her house from it, all while blaming me for getting hospitalized as a teenager and causing her to go bankrupt, and frequently pushing me in conversation to shower her with praise for letting me go to a mental health treatment center as a teenager when I told her I needed to be hospitalized because it got me on the right track. In my father's will, he wanted his mother, my grandmother, to be in charge of my brother's and I's money from his life insurance policy, and clearly didn't want my mother to be in control of it. Took out $100,000 in a couple different life insurance policies. After my father died, my mom had his body cremated right away before his mom arrived on a flight a day or two after she found out. My mom also moved all his stuff into boxes into her brother's basement for my grandmother to shift into. My grandmother found his will from a couple years ago in a box which clearly stated he wanted his mother to be in control of the money. When she arrived back to her home in Chicago a few weeks later, she found a second letter my dad mailed her before he died restating he wanted her to manage the money, along with account and policy numbers. The insurance companies took time to sort it out because the suicide letter wasn't notarized, and my grandmother took my mom to court over it. My mom wrote letters to the insurance company threatening them to just let her have the lump sum because I am the children's mother. I never saw any of it, save for maybe the $800 of that as tuition help from a college savings account from her in my years at college to pay off the book fees after my scholarships covered tuition. She always told me that she had saved me a college savings money, but you used all that up going to that hospital that summer when you were 15. I cut ties with my mother about 4 years ago after I had a child, and there was some troubling behavior developing. My father's mother was dying this summer, and I went to go visit her. Spent some time recalling the couple years that she took my mother to court after my father's death, and all of the money that she had taken from my father. She told me about money my father left us and how she fought my mom in court for the ability to manage it, but I didn't know it was much. When she passed and my aunt and I were packing her house up, we found binders and binders full of receipts for everything. This woman was a studious recorder and secretary and kept everything organized and labeled in page protectors and dividers and binders. I found a binder full of my dad's correspondence, his 1992 last will from his previous suicide attempt, and his suicide letter from when he died in 1995. I was always told that there was no suicide letter. In his letter written to his mom, there was the clear instructions as to the money he was leaving my brother and I, how to set up the right accounts, etc. He requested his mother be the person controlling the account, followed by my mom's parents before her own brother, clearly saying not her. Following in the binder was my mom's correspondence with the insurance companies, demanding the release of money to her, and the letters she wrote my grandmother belittling her and threatening her for getting a lawyer. My grandmother got copies of my mother's letters to the insurance, twisting claims around and even pressuring to release the money to her. My grandmother also kept all the check receipts of thousands of dollars that my father saved from sending her money when he was working on a project outstate. I was shocked, but not surprised, as I had no idea there was any money left for my brother and I. I was always under the assumption that we were pretty lower class. My mother guilt me so bad for making her go on Medicaid, so I could go to a residential treatment facility as a young teen, and for the psychiatric hospital visits for depression and anxiety. There were family secrets that my grandmother kept organized and neat for me to find. I also have a long audio recording of our last conversation where she told all these stories and let me know of the anger she has against my mom after all these years, and for the immediate cremation of his body before she got there. It finally made sense why my grandmother never saw us a lot growing up, but would always send us $50 or $100 bills growing up for birthdays and Christmas in her cards, even though she was on a fixed income. My mom would scoff and roll her eyes how that's too much money, and a few times even took the money away from us to put into savings, and we never saw again. But to my grandmother, take care of the kids and the money was my father's last wish, and she still felt that responsibility. Not a family member, but Nick was my elder brother Dave's closest friend. They went on holidays together when they were both single, would meet every Thursday for a beer and a curry at the local Indian restaurant, watch football together, and were good friends for some 20 years. 5 years ago, Nick died suddenly and tragically, aged 54. My brother couldn't contact him for 2 days, and so he got the police to break into his flat. Dave found Nick on the bathroom floor, toothbrush in hand, dressed and ready for work, his lunch on the kitchen counter ready to take with him. He'd been there for 2 days. Dave and Nick had recently returned from a holiday in Peru, and Nick had developed a clot in his leg after the long flight back to London. He'd been on medication for it, but the doctor was pleased with the progress and had reduced the medication. The clot had broken free and traveled to his heart, killing him. He had 2 elderly parents and a sister, but they asked Dave to go through his possessions for them. He asked me to help him do it. Dave found a small cash box and opened it. Inside was some £10,000 in cash, £50 notes all neatly counted and bound. Then I found one too, similarly full, and then another, and another. We found some £35,000 in cash. Dave then found some notebooks. They were filled with handwritten film/movie reviews, hundreds of them. He'd been going to the cinema at least twice a week for years, and Dave had no idea. We found details of investments. Nick had always said that his family were very long-lived, and so he had wanted to prepare for a long retirement. His flat was all paid up, too. In total, we found that Nick was worth around £700,000 and had never given a hint of it. He drove a modest used car, had no vices except regular foreign holidays, no sign of any reasonable wealth. Finally, we found details of a woman he had been in a relationship with. She was married and they had been very discreet. So discreet that even Dave had no idea. He had to call the woman from the number given in the notebook and explain to her. She had no idea, of course. It was all very, very hard. We took the cash to Nick's parents, both in their late 80s. They and his sister would inherit everything. Nick's father thanked us for our honesty and took 2 rolls of cash from one of the cash boxes and insisted we took one each. Dave offered to buy a painting that Nick had in his flat, a scene of a place they'd visited on one of their joint holidays, but his father wouldn't take any payment. He said Nick would have wanted him to have it. The painting now hangs in Dave's house. The saddest part of it all was that Dave and Nick had been friends for decades, but there was so much that Dave had no idea about. Why Nick chose to keep these things so secret initially upset Dave a great deal, but he came to realize that Nick had things that for whatever reason, he just wanted to keep to himself. He was a lovely guy, and Dave and I still miss him. R.I.P. Nick, you daft bugger. My father died first. When my mother died, she knew I'd be the one to clean everything out from the both of them. So, she gathered all the evidence and made absolutely sure I'd find what she wanted me to find, and left it for me on a clipboard on her desk. Through the letters my mother kept all the years they were married, I learned my father was in love with another woman. He absolutely did not want my mother, but came back only when she realized she was pregnant with me, and she got her father and his mother involved to force him to come back. He met the other woman in art school and was so happy. It shows in his letters. He was forced to drop out and would never be allowed to return to finish his degree. On one hand, I'm thankful he was my father and had some input in my upbringing. On the other hand, I wish he'd been allowed to follow his dream and become the artist he knew he could be. Good God, my parents hated each other. He was horribly unhappy and deeply depressed. And of course now I know why. She picked at him every day like a bloody scab. All the damn time just nagging. and he would blow up in return. Then he'd take his anger to the office and end up getting fired. Jesus, our family was so dysfunctional. I never knew love in a family. Never knew what it meant to feel happy. From the time I was really young, I just woke up feeling exhausted and wondered, well, what the hell is going to happen today? So yeah, thanks Mother for leaving that lovely little bit of information for me to find. Fuck you. TLDR, sexual pictures of a 7-year-old me. The question of whether my father was a pedophile had been tossed around all my life. My mother dumped him when she got pregnant. My grandmother insisted that I get to know my father. He had been thrown out of the local pool for getting a stiffy around kids, but had never actually gotten in trouble. He was autistic and had lost his mother and sister in a car accident when he was very young, so everyone just thought he was odd and traumatized. He married the special education teacher at my school who hated me and tried to convince me that I couldn't read. I was sent to her for writing issues and reading LOTR at home. I was manipulated and gaslit repeatedly when I expressed discomfort around him. I started having intrusive thoughts, and I wrote them down on my computer. He tried to take custody from my mom, who was also abused, when she tried to stop me from going to his house. Eventually, I told him that I wasn't his prostitute, and that paying my mom child support wouldn't make me pretend to love him. I was 9. They moved to Hawaii shortly after, where he worked as a substitute teacher. When I was 11, he used my email address and my computer, which I had because I couldn't do handwriting, to confess to his fantasies. But the police called my stepmother, who showed them what I had been writing. They immediately pegged me as dangerous. This was right after Columbine, and all they told me was in the letter were threats. That's what I grew up believing he thought of me. I didn't speak to my father again. A few years ago, I went to India and had a relationship with a tantric yogi. He asked me what I would need to find happiness, and I told him that I wouldn't know peace until my father died. A few months later, I returned to the US, and the news that my father had developed sudden onset cardiac sepsis. His heart rotted away. His wife sent me boxes of his old photographs, and in them were pictures of me, lying like my hands were tied with my legs spread. A few weeks later, my mother told me the true content of the emails. Seriously, fuck that guy. Not really a secret, more of a sad and morbid discovery. My dad worked for Microsoft for 25 years. He helped spearhead the original Xbox, and when I was young, we always had blank discs in our home for beta testing. It was a huge celebration when Xbox went a sale and all those buggy games we could get with actual covers on them. We had a big house and every console I could imagine at that time. He spent money like nobody's business. He loved his boat and his Porsche and what he could show off to people. Although he was always very generous to everyone and never thought he was above people from what I remember, he had just thought he made it, I believe. I think he did, for a very short time. But he was always coming up with the next $1 million idea. Mom divorced him when I was 9. He spiraled. His untreated bipolar and alcoholism got a hold of him. He was demoted and permanently fired from MS 3 years later. Right before he killed himself at 49, my dad lived with his 6 dogs in his mother's separated garage. I honestly wouldn't say separated, but just a garage with a bed set and microwave and TV in it, for a couple months beforehand. But then he had moved to living in motels and rehab houses for a couple months. He was in a half house when he killed himself. He never went to jail, but he got into Oxford, I guess. The worst thing I found going through his room was his diary. It was just a bunch of legal pad journals. You know, the yellow ones? They had scripts for plays written in them. Scripts about his dogs and him. And at the end, that was all it was. Just play scripts about him and his 6 dogs. But it was all about him living in an apocalypse situation and trying to live as long as they could. And him giving his last can of food to Sabu, his Italian greyhound. It was so disjointed and fucking juvenile. I could literally track his cognitive decline. He was so intelligent before. Out of everything I found when clearing out, this was the most heartbreaking. I could see his mind go in his writing when we had just spoken the day before. And I couldn't save him, but I did try my best. Not really a secret. I knew he was breaking, but I never knew that bad. And I still cry thinking about it now 7 years later. And this is the end of today's video. I hope you liked it, and don't forget to comment an anecdote or experience similar to the topic of the video. Leave your like, share if you like the video, and lastly, don't forget to activate the little bell so you don't miss any of our daily videos. Bye-bye.